And we have what I would consider to be a historic moment in the city of Houston, in that a community came together to enforce its legal rights and achieve a great victory in controlling sound in its neighborhood. And the real issue that came out of all of this is the utter failure by the city of Houston to show leadership in resolving a community problem. But the impressive thing is that neighbors were able to come together, file a lawsuit, work through the court system, which was a very imperfect way to approach the issue, because really it was a political issue that the city showed no leadership in whatsoever. But come together, enforce their rights, and attain basically a novel, groundbreaking approach to sound control in the city of Houston, and with White Oak Music Hall develop essentially a private sound ordinance for this area of the city of Houston, with new and increased rights for the citizens to protect their privacy, including a limitation on the number of shows at White Oak Music Hall, a stricter limitation on how late shows can go on during school nights. White Oak has to cut off at 9:30. No shows on star nights, star testing nights. Again, that has been an issue in the past. Sound monitoring, real-time sound monitoring, where there will be sound monitoring on the lawn and on the patio at White Oak Music Hall that the plaintiffs can watch real time, and sound limitations. So through the sound monitoring, the plaintiffs are going to be able to real time see when the sound limitations that were set in place by this consent judgment are violated. And then there will be the ability to go to court again to enforce their rights, and White Oak Music Hall will be penalized for violations of this agreement, starting at $5,000 up to $10,000, even $15,000, and potentially even harsher remedies beyond that if they are unable to abide by the agreements in this consent judgment, which was approved by the court yesterday. You each have a copy of the consent judgment. It is not the official signed copy, but it is the version that was signed. The official signed copy, I'm not sure if it's been posted online yet through the district clerk website, but that is the copy that was actually signed. So you have the essence of it right there. I can't stress enough, though, that what the neighbors in the near north side and Germantown were able to achieve is so impressive, because where the city and the city council member for that area failed to step up, show leadership, where the city allowed taxpayer dollars to be used to create this problem for this neighborhood, the citizens came together and worked with White Oak Music Hall through the litigation process to address the issue. And this is a critical first step, but it's just a first step. We are cautiously optimistic that White Oak Music Hall is going to do its job and uphold its end of the bargain and be a good neighbor, but it's cautious optimism. We will see. And there are remedies in place through this consent judgment that the neighbors now have to hold White Oak Music Hall accountable far beyond the weak, unenforceable City of Houston sound ordinance, which, if anything comes from this process, it should be that the city needs to take heed, think about development using taxpayer dollars to create hazards in neighborhoods, and think about rewriting the Houston sound ordinance. A big lesson that came out of this is that the Houston sound ordinance is unenforceable, and the city showed absolutely no leadership whatsoever in helping resolve this issue. And let me stress that this resolution came about through the work of White Oak Music Hall and the plaintiffs. The city took a conscious decision, made a conscious decision to not participate and to ignore this problem and put its head in the sand, and city leadership should be ashamed of itself. It was a true failure in democracy when week after week The neighbors in this area went to city council saying, please help us broker a resolution, please do something. And instead, the city stuck its head in the sand. That being said, I'm extremely proud of these plaintiffs and persevering. And I gotta say, White Oak Music Hall did make this agreement. We are cautiously optimistic they're gonna be a good neighbor. Let's keep our fingers crossed that the issue has been addressed. But if not, we're ready to go to the next step, and we will be back in court through the recourse allowed by this consent judgment. That being said, we're happy to take any questions.
How did they get the permit to begin with? Since it's music hall and,
It makes no sense to put a large stage like that in the middle of 3 neighborhoods whatsoever. And they got the permit because the city had its head in the sand. As far as I'm concerned, there's no explanation for how this all happened except that the city failed to show any leadership whatsoever. How it actually happened mechanically and internally, White Oak Music Hall had a lobbyist in there and doing all, whatever lobbyists do at City Hall. But I really can't answer it other than the city just put its head in the sand. Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
So the sound limitations, like how is that different than, how much louder or less loud will it be now with these sound limitations versus how it was?
Sure. So the City of Houston sound ordinance is unenforceable for multiple reasons. And the limits that the City of Houston poses are ambiguous. This creates defined restrictions that are real-time monitored. And through extensive testing that the plaintiffs did, a compromise was reached as to what those limits would be. And these limits, the actual spelled out limits, are tighter and lower than what the City of Houston sound ordinance would allow. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And for example, the City of Houston has one sound meter that a sergeant can use around this massive concert hall to enforce the City of Houston sound ordinance. And it's unclear where they would measure from. And you have at the same time in enforcing the sound ordinance, violent crime going on, you have I-45 car wrecks, you have all kinds of stuff going on. So the ability of the City of Houston to enforce the sound ordinance mechanically right there is in question. This consent judgment approved by the court allows for real-time sound monitoring, recording of data, verification of the limitations, and enforcement with this court. And that is way beyond anything the City of Houston sound ordinance allows for.
And who's paying for the monitoring?
It's White Oak Music Hall. White Oak Music Hall is paying for the sound monitoring as part of this agreement. And they have a very sophisticated system that measures not only overall sound but also octave bands. And I won't go too far into the science of sound, and believe me, I've learned more about that than I ever thought I would, other than hearing my own cranky voice sometimes. But it's equipment that allows this community, these plaintiffs, to enforce their rights.
You don't know how much that equipment costs, do you?
I don't off the top of my head.
Chris,
I'm-
did the plaintiffs win any monetary damages?
I'm not at liberty to say that, but and address that issue. But what I can say is that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of pro bono lawyer hours were put into this case. So maybe that speaks for itself.
Where the actual measuring instruments located?
As part of this agreement, it's discussed, the measuring equipment is at the front of house location, which is a technical term to those that put on music shows. And that's normally about 50 feet in front of the stage at center. And that is where the measurements will be taken. And on top, what?
I think it's 80 feet.
80 feet. And on top of all that, one thing I failed to mention is that the plaintiffs were able to negotiate a webcam that will actually monitor the monitoring equipment. So you can verify that no one's tampering with the equipment when shows are going on. So you can see the results real time of the sound monitoring on your computer, and you can also see the equipment itself and how it's being used. So it's not like somebody can just walk up and put a sock over a microphone or something like that.
Is that set up already?
Yes, it is set up.
Is that
Yeah.
public?
The actual real-time monitoring is not public, but the plaintiffs can use that data publicly if they need to. It's not like there's a public cam that you could go to, but the plaintiffs can publicly use that data if they need to enforce their rights under this consent judgment. I can't stress enough, though, how this is very unique and novel for the city of Houston. And if anything, maybe city leadership will be able to look at this document and see what it can do to improve sound enforcement in the city and get some ideas on how it should be handling these issues. And I got to tell you, since I started this litigation a couple years ago with this group of plaintiffs, I've had so many calls from people all over the city with various sound issues. This is not just an issue in this neighborhood. This may be the neighborhood with the worst issue in terms of a rock concert stage in the middle of a neighborhood. But this general issue with bars and other facilities and various industrial activities exists everywhere throughout the city of Houston. And hopefully that these neighbors plowed new ground that will help the city improve the quality of life here in our city.
Is this computer or receptacle, whatever, that they're gonna monitor, is it at a specific location, or is it throughout whoever's on that particular neighborhood website, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it would be, let's say this is the front of house location. There would be a set of monitors right there with the microphone that's broadcast to each of the plaintiffs at a designated private website that they can each access, and that's how it's monitored.
Is this fixed equipment, or is it brought in on a regular basis during events?
My understanding is that it's fixed but movable, but hence the webcam. So it can be verified it's there and properly set up at each event. And again, we are cautiously optimistic. Hats off to White Oak and allowing for that monitoring the webcam, and agreeing to that. That creates more trust and confidence. And so maybe going forward, everybody will be able to move on. But I just can't stress enough, we are cautiously optimistic. We'll see. This isn't perfect. There's still going to be a large concert stage in the middle of 3 neighborhoods, and that is, back to the issue of the city, again, using taxpayer dollars. These people, they're taxpayer dollars to help this development exist in the middle of their neighborhood. And for now, it's staying there.